Ladies and gentlemen, as chair of the board of trustees of the Fritt Foundation, it's my sincere pleasure to welcome you to this international conference on technology and the human future. Fritt is immensely grateful for its cooperation with the New York Review of Books. Our collaboration began with the event Weather Report, What Can We Do in New York in 2010, and where we brought together Scandinavian and US writers and researchers for a transatlantic discussion about the latest developments in global warming, the Copenhagen climate talks, and policy options for the future. It is precisely this discourse between the New York Review of Books, writers, academics from the US and Europe, and participants from Scandinavia that makes these events especially interesting. Earlier in the year, the New York Review of Books and Fritt have organized two international conferences. The Governance of China in Hong Kong in January, hosted by the University of Hong Kong, and the Middle East World Crisis in Berlin in June with the German Council on Foreign Relations as the local organizer. Key topics at both of these conferences, digital surveillance by governments and terrorism, will be included in some of the panel discussions at Fritt during the two-day conference. Technology and the human future will highlight the dynamic development we see in information technology and make us question what profound influences technology has on our lives as private individuals, in our interaction with each other, as public individuals in contact with the state, and in our lives as consumers and employees. For civil society, the problem is currently how to keep up with the rapid technological advances unfolding around us and to understand the full scope of the use of artificial intelligence. Data pioneer Kristen Nygaard's thoughts about technology provide some insight into understanding this field. His position as a professor, computer expert, and programmer afforded him opportunities to enhance employees' dignity and skills on every level. Humanistic values formed the basis for how technological systems were to be used. There are lessons to learn from this, to be learned from this. Today, we are experiencing growing anxiety about the threat of terrorism in Europe and North America alike. It is of the utmost importance that we be concerned about the role the state takes in terms of big data and monitoring and surveillance. We must ask ourselves how far the state can go, or perhaps rather how far the state already goes today. My wish is that this type of conference will help us reflect on the problems and challenges facing us today. It's now my pleasure to give the floor to Simon Head, Director of Programs for the New York Review of Books Foundation, to tell us more about this topic. Thank
you. Welcome. I want to begin by thanking Fritt for the wonderful welcome we've had coming from the United States and other parts of Europe here to Oslo, and the warmth and generosity of their welcome. Our partnership now has been going on, as the judge has said, for 6-7 years, and it's a very fruitful partnership. And I want to also say, to bring the greetings of Robert Silvers, editor of the New York Review of Books, and Ray Heffernan, the publisher, who sadly can't be here, but are certainly going to be following the conference very carefully. So why a conference now on this subject? And I think the answer is that there is a kind of wave of existential worry, if you like, about the role of advanced forms of technology in human life. And there are two quotes which struck me very strongly and which epitomize that. I'm not going to give the quotes in full because they come from a work by Professor Floridi, who's going to be contributing tomorrow and may want to use them, but they're from two of the iconic figures of the information age, and they're both saying basically the same thing. One of them is Bill Gates, needs no introduction, and the other is Stephen Hawking. And basically they're saying is, watch out. We're getting to the point where not only will we have artificial intelligence comparable to ours, but that artificial intelligence may be doing nasty things towards us. So this is not coming from the fringe, it's coming from two of the iconic figures of our time. So we have to perhaps pay attention to this. And I think it's part of as I say, a sort of wave of existential angst about the wilder shores of technology. So we're worried about robots. There's a wave of anxiety about robots, whether it's the actual physical robots, like in H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, which are kind of menacing and threatening to us, or the virtual robots, of which perhaps the most iconic is HAL, the robot in Kubrick's 2001, which is dangerous and threatening to the inhabitants of the spacecraft. We're worried, I think, about the wilder shores of technology because of the phenomenon of big data, the capacity of information systems to gather absolutely gigantic quantities of information which are yielded, among other things, by our daily lives, our minute-to-minute daily lives. Our use of IT artifacts and our iPhones are yielding these phenomenal quantities of information which are in the public sphere and which can be analyzed and used in various forms, whether it's by corporations or by governments. And we have a sense that these technologies are moving at a very fast rate. They affect our lives, they affect our relationship with employers, and they affect our relationship, above all, with the state. And we have to correlate that with the increasingly dangerous age we live in, with the rise of extreme terrorism. And so there is going to be a pressure on the state to perhaps start exploiting its access to big data and to analyze it in order to watch us. And how far do we want to allow the state to go in doing this? So these are all primordial issues, and that's why we have the words human future in the title. These are trends and movements which really do affect the human future. And I think one of the profound challenges of the civic society is to keep track of these things, to understand them and know what's going on. Because if you look at the first industrial age in the 19th century, the rise of the machine age, one of the reasons why there were powerful reform movements arising in the second half of the 19th century, whether they were social democratic, trade unions, or revolutionary even, is that the civic society did know and understand what was going on behind the dark satanic walls of the textile plants, which Marx wrote about. They knew. And therefore, there is a need today to know and understand what these technologies are and the directions in which they're going. And I think one of the worrying characteristics of the present day is that perhaps the civic society is lagging in its comprehension of what's going on. And that's why conferences like this can have a role, and the work and writings of many of the people contributing here also have a role in making sure that the civic society is up to speed in understanding the nature of these technological developments. So welcome to everybody. I think we're going to have a very interesting conference, and let the first panel begin. Thank you.
Yes, hi. I'm Farsethås, and I'll be chairing this panel. First, I want to thank the Fritt Foundation and the New York Review of Books Foundation for making this conference happen and for bringing so many distinguished guests here. And thank you all in the audience for coming out. So in this panel, we have been given the task of discussing the internet, the always-on player, and life itself, no less. Life itself. That opens up a lot of possibilities. And during this conference, we'll have other panels discussing surveillance, the impact in the office place and the workplace, and questions relating to how technology affects the relationships between states and its citizens. What this panel will focus on is the question, and I think the very popular question, of what, if any, are the consequences of the digital technology on our everyday experiences, on human interactions and relationships. And to discuss this, we have an excellent panel with just diverse enough backgrounds and fields of research to give us so many different paths into this matter. First, we have Marina Warner, historian, literary scholar, novelist, short story writer, professor of English literature and creative writing at Birkbeck College in London. Now, she has written on issues ranging from the cult of the Virgin Mary and Joan of Arc to Britain in the 20th century. And she was awarded the Holberg Prize in 2015. And is indeed, as you can read in the biographies following the conference program, appointed Dame of the British Empire. And the reason that she is given so many wonderful titles, I think, is simple. She is able to use art, literature, myth, legends, and stories, history itself, as a prison to explore issues at stake in contemporary society, which she will today apply to the internet. Now, Marina Warner has written a book called Stranger Magic, Charmed States and the Arabian Nights. And as by divine intervention, or just perhaps excellent planning on the part of the New York Review of Books and Fritt, our second speaker, Virginia Heffernan, has just released a book on digital culture called Magic and Loss, the Internet as Art. So I do expect some magic will take place here today. Now, Heffernan's book argues that the internet is a massive and collective work of art and also a work in progress. And the book, I think, suggests that the idea of our attention spans deteriorating in response to the internet is something of a myth that can be discussed. Heffernan has an excellent vantage point to look at how we respond and discuss the internet from another point of view as well. She is a writer and a cultural critic and has written on TV a lot, and so she'll be able to look at how the responses, reactions, and interpretations of the new media of television was back in the day as compared to our responses and interpretations of the internet on relationships now. And she's also a frequent user of social media, so she'll be able to speak of it also from a user perspective. And lastly, we have Elisabeth Staksrud, an associate professor of the Department of Media and Communication Studies here at the University of Oslo. And Staksrud has done extensive research on the users of digital technology that people seem the most interested in, namely that elusive category that we call the young. Of course, everyone has an opinion of how young people are using the internet or how the internet is using them. But unlike most of us, Staksrud has some real research and findings to back up her views. She's a part of the world's largest research project on children and online risk, EU Kids Online, and she'll be sharing insights from this research project and from her book, Children and the Online World, Risk, Regulation and Rights. So during this session, we will be hearing about music, we'll be hearing about the internet as a creative endeavor. We'll be contemplating historical parallels between the cultural impact of other in their time new media and what is happening now. And we'll be hearing about the very specific concerns of kids growing up with an online presence as a lived reality and not as an option to opt out of. So one way that we all know the digital reality affects us is in giving us some new rituals. And so one of these rituals I will perform before I give the word to the distinguished speaker, and that is the ritual of asking you all to turn off your phones. So we'll be able to test in real times as we speak our needs to stay connected and check our phones, and our reaction to that when that access is restricted. So you may ask, why does she get to have a phone on stage? Because you will see me having a phone on stage. It's not to check my messages, but because fittingly for this subject, I have no other means of telling the time than my cell phone. And I don't see any wristwatch in the human future for myself. So why is time of an essence here? It's because our speakers have been given 15 minutes each for their introductions, and I will tell them to stay within that time limit. Then we'll have a discussion between our three panelists, and then we will open up for the questions that you will no doubt have in your minds during their introductions. So if you hear anything being said up here that you want to question, please just write that down, and there'll be time for questions later. So I think it's time to let the magic begin, and I give the word first to Marina Warner.
Good morning. Thank you all for coming, and thanks very much to the Fritt Foundation and the New York Review of Books for inviting me. When our forebears imagined the afterlife, they attributed several properties with refined variations in degree and horror and punishment inflicted on the dead. Their projections of the underworld, mythological and Judeo-Christian, share certain dominant features, and several of these have become manifest in the World Wide Web, as we are enmeshed in its configuration of time and space. A sense of endless multiplicity, of phantasmic immateriality, grinding repetition, and pandemonium. The underworld, Hades, Sheol, Hell, was also imagined as a place where something horrible had happened to time. It had stopped altogether, and yet it goes on going on endlessly. The land of the dead unfurled an eternity where the past remained present all the time and nothing was ever erased. There was both the impossibility to forget and at the same time the horror of oblivion. Incidentally, the Inferno was also a free site of invention. Find the arrows. Where poets and artists and theologians gave rein to imagining grotesque torments, monstrous couplings and degradations, the religious playground for pornography. It is one of the strangest consequences of the new eschatological space of the web that a law, termed the right to be forgotten, was passed in 2014. Demanding to be forgotten may be a novelty for a species generally intent on the opposite, on making a mark. But belated negation as a response to the power of the internet and its massive further potential power is not enough. As this conference sets out, we need to go on the offensive, strategically and preemptively. The metaphor of a web is actually less apt than a net, because the internet is a tool. It is really more of a loom than a net, and its products could take a myriad forms, many varieties of fabric and fabrication. To mistake its current products for ineluctable consequences is to mistake the irrigation system for the water that flows through it, and for the loaf of bread grown from the field of corn that it was used to water. The medium is not the message. It is not in itself. That statement is in itself an ideological position, and it requires modification. Yet it would be hypocritical of me not to mount some defense before I move on to the ways the internet is, to my mind, reconfiguring existence as it's lived through our consciousness, especially that part of consciousness we call memory and imagination. Since the cognitive scientists have revealed that we use the same parts of the brain to project scenes and experiences we are only discovering through reading about them, as to remember events that have happened to us personally. Significantly, Leonardo was one of the few people to conjecture that this was the case when he drew a cross-section of the brain and showed the faculties of reason, imagination, and memory tightly wrapped around one another in osmotic contact under the skull. Unlike most previous thinkers who had speculated about the structure of mind, he did not put memoria and fantasia and ratio in separate boxes. And today, the findings of cognitive scientists show that the 15th century artist-scientist had come closer to his predecessors in finding the way the brain works. This matter becomes important because digital representations have the capacity to supplant real lived experiences. In what is a welter of issues, I'm going to pick out 4 main points. First, more of a plus than a minus, the depth and speed of research. Now, I've found as a sort of inveterate book reader and library hunter that no matter how abstruse my pursuit, the object of my pursuit, I will find it somehow digitally copied on the net with unbelievable speed. So things that used to be journeys to distant countries, long days in dusty libraries, have become the matter of a click. And that is quite an extraordinary boon. And I'm sure you all know that and have experienced the same thing. And yet, at the same time, the Internet's vast deposits of accessible information do not train us to use the tool. And it is indeed crucial to many of the commercial operations on the net that you don't, and probably political operations too, that you don't know how to discriminate, but only to crave more. Funes the Memorious, the protagonist of Borges's fable, may be the most prophetic figure in 20th century literature, someone who cannot forget anything, who cannot discriminate or arrange knowledge into intelligible syntheses, whose formidable brain is like the time machine plugged into my computer, which records every instantiation of every word as I write and as I browse. Second, again, largely plus, but also some minus, proximity and connectedness. The internet also interacts symbiotically with the mass movements of peoples today, including those fleeing war zones, as it connects them to their dispersed relations and to their longed-for destinations elsewhere. The powers of the mobile phone with its camera and its recorder are both lifesavers and catalysts for the young people swept up and the older people swept up in the huge dislocations convulsing the world. For refugees in Sicily, who've landed there after risking the terrible passage across the Sahara and the Mediterranean, the most indispensable item they hold on to is a phone. No papers, and possess only the clothes they stand up in. They keep a sealed, waterproof pouch around their necks to hold the device. If they lose their phone at sea, it is one of the first things the authorities try to provide for them. Earphones dangling their white threads are a symbol of their human citizenship of the world, and they are extremely adept at using them with Instagram and Facebook, etc. As Virginia Heffernan points out at the beginning of her book, it is the poor and the disadvantaged who desire and need this kind of connectivity, but that is not a reason to despise it. Immense distances, social and physical, have shrunk through telecommunications. Clusters of individuals and even large proportions of some populations are regrouping in different patterns in other places as their conversations across space bring them closer to one another. This new proximity is shrinking the world and also flattening it. The intimacies gained are often shallow. We're seeing on the one hand a worldwide dissolution of boundaries and enclosures around global networks of culture, music, literature, knowledge, money, and nation-states at the same time. Knowledge, money. And nation-states at the same time are furious, countervailing oppositional forces. Brexit in my country, Trump's wall on the Mexican-US frontier, the detention centers and refugee camps that aim to contain these flows, including the movement of people. So these two forces in clashing. I see this as a contest between a classical geometry of Euclidean forms, the cube, the pyramid, which are defined containers that include some and exclude others, and a modern fluid topology as embodied in the tiling patterns of arabesque that keeps generating and branching, endlessly dynamic and embracing, with the capacity to flip figure and ground so that exclusion or inclusion need to be redefined. The internet, at its most fertile, wait, there should be one more before that. Oh, no, that's right. The internet at its most fertile can be placed under the sign of this generative arabesque and the constellated macarnas of Moorish architecture. As Marshall McLuhan noted a while ago when he wrote, "Electric circuitry is orientalizing the West. The contained, the distinct, the separate, our Western legacy, is being replaced by the flowing, the unified, the fused." The social effects of the internet can be understood in this light. The connectivity generates clusters rather than the same way as a tray of shapeless piles of sand and grit will, when its receptacle is shaken or vibrated, gradually settle into coherent and even beautiful patterns and relations. The messiness of the web crystallizes into sets of collectibles for the surfers of eBay, into groups of like-minded connoisseurs and hobbyists, desirous specialists in taste of this or that, and Facebook friends. And one sphere of activity that can grow with rich potential through this efflorescing property of the internet is narrative. The web is a sea of stories, flowing streams of creative imagination and intermingling memories and fantasies. And I've started a project with refugee communities called Stories in Transit in order to irrigate and fertilize for them this possibility of the use of the web. Thirdly, the return to oracy and the culture of the spoken word. Several of the most powerful creative minds, this is Penrose tiling, the most beautiful example of contemporary arabesque. Several of the most creative minds today work aloud. After a brief spell, in terms of durée, of silence, reading and writing, an era that lasted, roughly speaking, from mass printing to the invention of radio and the wireless technologies that followed, literature has returned to its ancient habit, oral communication. Kind of what I'm doing here, and the fact that it's being recorded for oral broadcasting. The web has made possible new forms of acoustic and oral performance, records of everything from elegies to stand-up comedy, and they are inspiring marvelous, innovatory new literary work. Amongst the writers who are using the web in this way is the classicist Alice Oswald, astonishing poem called called Memorial, a reworking of the Iliad, and Svetlana Alexievich, whose oral chorales of voices gathered from the former Soviet Union form a kind of musical, even though they're on the page, form a kind of musical sound-to-sound vocal score. And the web is filled with gloriously rich archival websites of this new cultural oracy and an encouraging number of online mixed media literary journals that incorporate sound. It's entirely in keeping with this trend in cultural taste that the Nobel Committee chose Bob Dylan. Fourthly, this is my last section. Now to a salient area of damage, as I see it. These powerful and productive effects, agility, speed, range, accumulation, connectivity, acceleration, and the capture and immediacy of voiced culture, impinge powerfully on memory and its processes. The web mimics the branching and firing of the brain in many ways, or at least it appears to offer a dazzling mirror of thought itself, its aleatory quickness of association and retrieval. But this effect of replication, of the software acting as a quasi-organic prosthesis for the mind, is misleading. And the delusion and the damaging effects that are consequent upon it need attention and redress through other channels of inquiry and learning and art, it seems to me. The chief drawback lies in the absence of the full sensorium in using the internet, and this lack can't be fixed by adding scratch and sniff patching, though that will probably happen in the virtual reality headsets. The memoir involontaire Proust tapped into requires acts in space and time that activated the sense, stubbing his toe, dunking the Madeleine in the tea. And this coordination of the senses in acts of memory and in acts of imagination as memories are remembered, resurrected, and reimagined is necessary. We all know how memories of someone or of a story can come back to mind by reorientating oneself in space, where one was at the time, where one was at the time. The neuroscientists tell us that this returns us to our beginnings as hunters and our needs to sense where we are in relation to others, to helpers, to prey, to dangers. Similar ancient capacities form our sense of smell. In his recent incisive account, Thinking with Literature, Terence Cave applies cognitive psychology and consciousness studies to the written artifact and stresses the crucial role played by kinesic intelligence, that is understanding through embodied, mobile, and sensory processes. The look of the stuff on our screens has been devastatingly critiqued by Virginia, amongst others. So I take that for granted and want to move now from software to hardware, from the spatial and immaterial operations of the net and of word processing, and look instead at the kinesic experience of the digital devices that have become so indispensable to our relations with one another, as well as our communings with our own thoughts. The dominant sensation involved in using a smartphone or a keyboard is slippery. The surfaces are cold, gleaming, opalescent, and smooth to the touch to start with. When they heat up, they convey a sense of unease. Warmth is not the most desirably healthy state. The aesthetic, brilliantly developed by Dieter Rams, for example, for Braun in the 50s, and then refined splendidly by Jonathan Ive for Apple, aligns the new technology with forensic utility. The metal and glass and plastic are hygienic, sterile, hard, trim, and easily wipeable. They are made to look clean, even enthrallingly inviolate. I've also made immaculate whiteness the unmistakable brand of Apple products, a whiteness unadorned except by translucent logos in silver print or opaline glass. It's not far-fetched that one of Dieter Ramsey's most famous designs is known as Snow White's coffin. The design tunes the perceptive range of the owner of the device to certain sensations and not to others. It relegates sensory experiences that extend beyond this limited hygienic compass. Or to look at this context in another way, the design excludes certain forms of knowing from the start and consequently limits the sensorium of the user. The glassiness is literally glazing. The attentiveness it asks for does not alert us, it dopes us. The attention that is being bought is being shaped and degraded. Although, as I said before, sound has returned to literature through the web, the senses of touch, smell, and taste are shrunken in learning through the internet, while depthless and weightless images enclosed in the screens dominate the visualizing processes. One consequence is that visual effects are constantly turned up to gain impact. Although listening is better served, it is not always the case in relation to precision of hearing or quality of sound. Our ways of acquiring understanding, especially in the zone of eroticism, are denatured. The mot juste for this smooth aesthetic is glabrous, meaning gleaming and hairless, like the marble Venuses sculpted in the 19th century. But devices do not have, however, to kindle these mortuary or surgical associations. They could be made of durable fabrics, such as burlap or cork, or of knobbly stuff, satisfying, like pebbles. I don't know, I'm not a designer, but I do call for some new ideas that would restore haptic consciousness to the learning on the web. You may think this is trivial, a mere detail, wrapping indeed, but its restriction of intelligent cognitive capacities reinforces the medium's control of the human being, make it easier to nail our attention and treat us consequently as mineable data. I just want to end with showing you some remarkable experiments done by Joseph Albers at Black Mountain College in the 30s. His methods, I think, are worth paying attention to today because he understood the interwoven character of intelligent perception. Albers distinguished matière from material, and he asked students to improvise with both in order to stretch their abilities to think and do things. Matière is stuff as it appears to the senses, the properties of structure, texture, color, facture. Material is the stuff understood in relation to its capacities, its pliability, elasticity, conductivity, fragility, and otherwise. Albers was aiming at releasing creativity in artists and designers, but his inspiring analyses apply far more widely. And in a wonderfully clear and vigorous way, they fashion a pedagogical method in modern circumstances in line with the fundamental Lockean tenets about the need to train the organs of understanding. Locke alerted readers to consider how much one may be beholden to experience, improvement, and acquired notions. Albers and his colleagues prepared these assemblages of stuff, incongruous stuffs, to embody the matières and materials and stimulate the perceptions and, in consequence, the intelligence of the students. Reading or viewing on the screen from webcast images offers a very narrow range of matières and materials. Does this matter? Am I being fussy and cranky in complaining about the glabrous aesthetic? To my mind, it's damaging in two ways. One rather general, and the other rather particular, but both serious. I've noticed while teaching students who have grown up in the cyber age that they don't grasp and hold mind pictures from reading on the screen. In some ways, the eerie match between data flowing weightlessly on a computer screen with the immateriality of mental processes cuts out that passage through the senses that sets memory working and storing. It's not only that schoolchildren and students today can't concentrate, as is often said. Not exactly. It's that they can't because they haven't developed haptic and sensory faculties to make their memories absorbent, and they aren't offered prompts to bring them into action, which helps form mental images of a scene such as. This is a passage from Keats's Eve of St. Agnes, a poem that I've worked with students. So at one point he says, "The tiger moth's deep damasked wings." At another point he writes, "Rose bloom fell on her hands together pressed, and on her silver cross soft amethyst." So we're getting a lot of soft touches here, haptic touches here. So, and that, I think that's very difficult for them to bring that up into their full mind's eye. Finally, on the smaller point, it seems that young women are being encouraged to shave their pubic hair by young males who accepted the glabrous as right and proper and the hairy as wrong and dirty for women as a consequence of pornographic norms. This doesn't seem to me to arise from any kind of natural disgust at all, but from inculcated values rooted in overdetermined optics to the detriment of all the other senses that play a vital part in erotic knowledge and sensual pleasure. Glabrousness here follows from deprivation and ignorance. The internet is acting as a massive opiate, like the soma in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, stimulating the senses in certain directions and dulling them in others. Jonathan Carrere commented very acutely, "The more habitual and repetitive one's perceptual response to one's environment is, the less autonomy and freedom characterize that individual existence. The rise in self-harm, psychological trouble, I imagine we'll hear about this later, among young people may follow from this." To conclude, the writer Ruth Padell once told me that a primary school group was visiting the London Zoo in the days when the big cats enclosure still contained tigers. The children had been carefully prepared by the teacher for the outing, with lessons about the animals they were going to see, with web materials, video footage, and maps and photographs. When they reached the big plate glass window of the big cat's enclosure, one little girl looked and then gasped, and then she turned to her teacher with shining eyes and she said, "But miss, you never said the tigers would be real." Thank you.
What an astonishingly wide-ranging talk. Thank you very much. And it netted for me the word glabrous, which I've proposed to Johnny Ive a new aesthetic, not that he listens to me, but founded around psoriasis and rashes. When the iPad was first released, one of the claims of it, one of its boasts was that it was oleophobic. It hates oil. And I think Apple, and before that, Braun's sort of hatred of the human body, of our hairs and our oils, is evident in the phone itself. Incidentally, I don't have Wi-Fi on my phone, and I'm using only the notepad. I do think it's interesting that we need to morally excuse ourselves from the habit of Twitter and make it clear that we're still working with objects that stay where they are and not talking to our friends at the same time we ought to be concentrating. I came to the internet in 1979, which is a little bit of a contradiction. It wasn't called the internet. It was ARPANET era, and through some strange accident, the great Hungarian computer scientist John Kemeny had come to Dartmouth College, in Hanover, New Hampshire, where I grew up. And in exchange for installing this giant mainframe computer, the heaving rhinoceros behind bulletproof glass, like the tigers, he had made a deal with the town that he would educate the school children in the computer language BASIC. It was 10 years after the moon landing when I came to it, and in order to persuade our parents that we needed dumb terminals little bit like Chromebooks that you could dial in to this mainframe and connect to the wider world. We were instructed to tell them that we could one day work for NASA if we got a computer like that. He gave a lecture to the school children. I can't imagine how Kemeny must have felt. He'd been Einstein's assistant at the Advanced Institute of Princeton, and all of a sudden he had to talk to 3rd and 4th graders about his computer language. But he had written BASIC to be accessible to people, and to be accessible to people in the humanities. And this is the 60s. One of the first things he did when he arrived in New Hampshire was archive the poetry of Robert Frost. A uniquely American poet in the vein of New England. So the idea that there was a military project called ARPANET that was indifferent to the humanities and to humans, I think it was pretty early on that computer scientists were interested in natural language and were interested in the humans who wrote and spoke it. So anyway, he taught us a simple program that could allow you to say that your brother was an idiot and happy birthday to yourself. And those things delighted me. And of the 200 kids, I think, present, delighted also 4 others of us. As everyone filed out, the rest of us moved closer to find out what this thing was. And I was one of them, and the rest of them were boys. They went on to learn to code. And I took the road less traveled, I guess, and decided to see if I could play Dungeons and Dragons. And I cruised over to the Kiewit Computing Center and met sysprogs for the first time, system programmers who were, sysprog sounded to me like lead singer sounds to other girls. I just was dazzled by them. And instantly they hooked me up with their way of using the computer. Like so many other, we recognize them from the web of today and from apps. Their for communicating problems in programming had devolved into chat with game elements. So anyway, I persuaded, in order to do this thing, Conference XYZ was what it was called, Excalibur. So it was the 70s. It had like an Arthurian theme with like sort of damsels and steeds language and runic symbols. Before trolling, there was something called scrolling, where you could trick someone by sending them like pages and pages of ampersands, as if that was, anyway, we thought it was the height of humor, to scroll someone and make their screen, go up and up with ampersands, sometimes forming a face. So I convinced my parents to buy this terminal that I've just written about for the Paris Review because it captured my attention, more than captured. I was enraptured by this screen. I could hardly take my eyes off it. It was the green phosphor letters that you can recognize from movies like War Games in the front of the screen in the foreground. And they were, to my eye, inscribed on a deep space background, fathomless space. I spent at least 10,000 hours in front of that thing, tying up the family phone line hour after hour. Occasionally, my mother would pick up the phone and break in on my modem connection, which infuriated me, even though I kept the phone busy for as many hours as she would let me play it. That's the other thing. We called it not using the internet, and certainly I wasn't considered a user or a reader, but more a player. Stop playing the computer. Stop playing the computer. So with the idea of playing the computer, and it was networked computing, but not the idea of an internet, and that particular screen, I came away with the idea that those, and much, much later, I would read Erich Auerbach's masterpiece, Mimesis, and realize that something in the very loose connections, much pre-bitmap, pre-pixmap connections of that dark background and the green letters allowed me to supply connections the way that Auerbach points out that readers of the Torah do. there's something in the syntax of those letters, and often we were using, you could only use, in some ways, certain times you could only use 3 characters for communication. And so, I sat there as I grew into adolescence, forming an impression that some people have when they see the night sky, when they see a beautiful work of art, when they confront a cancer diagnosis, that there was something deep and rich out there and language only sat on the surface of that thing. And it was intoxicating to me. I know that people who come to computers as a research tool, they come to them as a tool of surveillance, they come to them as a calculating tool, have different impressions. But I came to the internet as a game, and I've been unable to think outside those 2 properties of the internet, that it was both a game or an art form with game elements. I should quickly say that one of my advisors in graduate school, Philip Fisher, takes issue with the claim that art is deceptive. And instead argues, like Wittgenstein and others, that it's a game element. Or that it has properties of game. I never mistook my first avatar, Athena. I was a chubby 9-year-old, so naturally I wanted to be a warrior, wise warrior. I never mistook her for myself, any more than I would have mistaken the shoe or the hat for me if I were playing Monopoly. And I'm not sure that on the soccer field, as you can probably gather, I'm not very athletic. But from what I've seen of sports, it doesn't seem that people mistake themselves off the field for power forwards. So keeping that distinction between me and that avatar has been an important personal project, but also in advising parents about how not to lose their kids in the massively multiplayer online role-playing game that is the internet. I think I try to take pains to encourage parents trained in the liberal arts not to imagine the internet like we used to imagine social, or parents sometimes used to imagine social life or sexuality as something that needed to either be abstained from or put serious curbs on. So like 20 minutes a day of internet use is something like you can only go to second base, or people in girls' schools could only have 3 feet, something like there had to be 3 feet on the floor at all times, right? And these things are thought about as though they were science, that kids should only spend 20 minutes a day on the computer, or they can only use it for schoolwork. Instead, I ask that we encourage our kids using the tools of the humanities to create powerful avatars that hold that place for us online. My son, who's 11, just created his first online profile picture for his Google account, and I noticed he had taken something like 300 selfies in order to nail the right one. And what he came up with was not far from Athena. It was someone leaning back, reclining like this, with his hands around, on the back of his head, as if he was leaning back in a swivel chair as CEO of some corner office. And I said, "Oh, my little beautiful son, why did you choose this picture?" And he said, "Doesn't it look powerful? Doesn't it look powerful?" Much later, teenagers tend to fear that they won't make connections with those first early avatars, and that's when they turn to sad brunette and gay boy, looking for connections. But that avatar creation, it needs to be imaginative, it needs to be ironic, deliberate choices around taking topless photos. It's not hard to remember, as in this Bruegel painting, that and in early frescoes, that self-portraiture didn't begin with Instagram. So what was I discovering when I looked into that black deep space? What was I trying to fathom? And I think I was trying to fathom, for someone uncomfortable in social space, I mean, I can't claim to be despised and disenfranchised entirely, but I was a child. What I was imagining was I think in some ways other people. And we're now at the, I think, 3 billion mark with people who touch the internet almost every day. So it's, there is almost no mind, or at least I haven't met a mind capable of taking the measure of that many people. In general, in the book, this is the Magic and Loss book, I ask that we imagine that the internet is a massive work of representational art. That is so seductive a representation of reality that we often mistake it for life itself. And this is us losing our heads, those of us those of us trained in the humanities lose our heads when we start thinking that the internet is life itself, or start thinking that it's not a logical extension of the forms that preceded it. Sometimes almost everyone, including my son, like to map a story before they knew about the internet. He's 11 years old. The web was well underway when he was born, and he still tells a story that sounds like all of our stories. Do you remember it? There was a time before I had a tablet. What did that feel like? I have been, there are even classicists working now on something called self-digitizing communities about, in ancient Greece, groups of people who behaved like computers and binary systems. I think I would argue that there has always already been networked computing in one form or another. I report as much as I do research. I'm not an academic, and one of the things I discovered about early YouTube is that some of the people who took to it most heartily, most robustly from the beginning were people who had trained during the Second War in radar and sonar, and then almost waited for an opportunity to use something like YouTube. Their minds had been looking forward to it and came on early on. Geriatric 1929 is a heavy user of YouTube. I guess when I think about the themes of this conference, I guess what I'm asking is that we imagine that the anxiety expressed in some of our, in some of the writing about the internet, and some of, I gotta frankly say, sophistry around the internet, is generated by this representational work of art itself. It's an effect of that. As the magic is, so is the loss. So we end up with this, pained sense that something is missing, that something's hurting us, and then rush in to fill that hole with ideas from 20th century conceits, often around surveillance, the power of the state, the new, relatively new, and to my mind, unformed field of neuroscience that has attempted to kind of cannibalize all thinking about the internet. And when I say thinking about the internet, I mean thinking about photography, poetry, music. These are not things that we should cede to a very, very new science, unrigorous science that calls itself neuroscience, but has very little to do with the biology of nerves that neurology began to be the treatment of. That's a little sideswipe on a personal agenda. So why are we anxious? Well, first of all, it's the specter of other people. I did do a dissertation and started with hopes of being an academic. And in that dissertation treated at length both eschatology, especially in William James's writing, but analogous writing that's something like eschatology in the apprehension of Henry James of Ellis Island, when to him amazing number of 1 million immigrants a year were passing through Ellis Island. To him, that sounded like 3 billion, or it sounded like the number of Syrian refugees, and other refugees. nomadic in the world right now. So he had special dispensation to just go and behold Ellis Island, and it's something like Wordsworth apprehending the sublime. He looks at these people being fumigated, herded, and he's horrified. He's horrified. And he can't believe that he's going to have to, I think he says, share the American consciousness with these people. And I hear in that a lot of the disgust and fright that we often express about a phenomenon like Twitter. The New Yorker went so far as to call Twitter a cesspool. Incidentally, they called Twitter a cesspool on Twitter. The New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, all uses these tools, but uses them with so much self-loathing, self-savagery around it. And I'm not entirely sure that this is distinct from, if we need to understand Trump's revulsion at the specter of immigrants and asylum seekers and refugees, we might consult our own horror at something like YouTube comments or Twitter. Something about the specter of bad grammar, of subliteracy often being people trying to communicate in what's become the lingua franca of the internet, speaking, as many of you do, in English as a second language, as a third language. Often, although so many of you are perfectly bilingual, but off your games in these second and third languages. And yet it's astonishing to find out. I was at Google not long ago, and even at Google that owns YouTube, their chief complaint about the internet is YouTube comments. You may know, I don't know if this is true in the European press, many of our newspapers have shut down the capacity for people to comment on articles. There's not a journalist alive who doesn't complain that those comments have this undermining purpose. You set up a bylined article. I've had this experience myself. It's perfect, it's fact-checked, it's orderly, it's, prefrontal lobe or whatever, it's the superego. And then all of a sudden, underneath it, under the line are teased out some of the id-like themes in the article you've written. So you might write something about microphone technology that touches on something, Hillary Clinton using microphones. I love audio technology. A piece is entirely written about the microphone, but I mention Hillary Clinton, and in the comments, lock her up. There's nothing, there's zero engagement with what I thought was my tightly reasoned argument. And there are times when I wonder, is that, how much did I write that with that intention? So I think that there are, two kinds of fears that we have. The first, as I say, is sort of a fear of other people. There's an effort underway in Silicon Valley to renovate meetings. And when I spoke to people about meetings, and they almost invariably roll their eyes. Meetings are nothing but, two or more people in a room together. And yet the amount of attention poured on the problems of meetings is nothing but the hell is other people apprehension by another name. And this is, I think, what Henry James was experiencing at Ellis Island. I realize I'm constrained for time, and I respect that. So I'll also say the other feeling of loss that I think we get when we see the internet, and I'll conclude on this, is one, as I say, generated by the work itself, by this masterpiece of civilization. On the one hand, it's obviously a move to increasing abstraction, to an increasing symbolic order. And that always, and I think finance is a great touchstone here, is deranging, is upsetting. You take the move from gold ingots, it's also a story we tell ourselves all the time, through inscription, through paper money, through electronic pulses, and now to Bitcoin, and someday I want to put together a mashup of people explaining Bitcoin, because they almost always begin with, it's very simple, and then 20 minutes later are making gestures about what Bitcoin is. Bitcoin almost defies description, as derivative securities did before that. And the same is true of the internet. So unsurprisingly, we have that same longing for material culture that we've missed. And that, I think, is an effect of that move to increasing abstraction. Arguably, of course, abstraction is not the worst thing that's ever happened to us. I just reviewed a book by a woman about teenage girls using the internet, story after story about how horrible it is that pornographic images are distributed, some of them photoshopped and turned into currency, and many, many warnings about how bad this is for young girls. And it didn't occur to me till I finished that I had had the same lecture in the 1980s, but it surrounded pregnancy, rape, and STDs, damage to the body. For all it must be terrible. It is terrible to be cyberbullied. It is somewhat worse to be physically violated. The culture's pushed back on these in interesting ways, and I won't get into all of them. We can talk about them here, but that oleophobic sensibility has been counteracted by all kinds of new ways of treating the material world, maker culture, Burning Man, these almost erotically physical experiences. And I'll end on this. In its wisdom, one of the ways the culture is pushed back on digitization, and I'm now writing a book about anti-digitization, is there's a group of kids in Silicon Valley, of all places, who have started taking LSD in the morning in order to break their addictions to their phones, in order to stop looking at this glassy image. And what they've found is the faces of people on the bus have become so fascinating. You don't need LSD. You don't need LSD. Thank you.
Okay. Just a little technological. Okay. So I also brought my phone because I don't have a clock. So. I also want to thank for being invited to this very fun event. So when I started thinking about what to tell you, and I come from one of the is research with children and youth and online risk, but I also worked on others. I was reminded of the following. So when I was a little girl growing up in small village outside of Oslo, extremely rural, my upbringing entailed 3 rules. That sort of sums up everything my parents thought I needed to learn to become an adult and a normal human being. The first thing was that I should never, ever enter a car if a man came by and offered me candy. However, as communication with generations often failed to qualify the concerns, they never explained to me what the problem was. So I spent a lot of time in my childhood wondering, what if he doesn't have candy? Can I join? And nobody really explained to me why this candy was so important. The second thing, which I was often told, perhaps weekly, was that I never ever should start using drugs. And in that lies a general rule of never being allowed to communicate or play with people from a place called Kolbotn, which was considered a danger in itself. But the third thing, and the rule that I learned the most, and some of you are not going to get this, but this is what was hollered through the house every single day especially by my dad, was that never ever should I, regardless of any circumstance, call long distance. So this sort of sums up how my parents considered the importance of, and I found it fascinating that this, which is the technology, was the most important thing. And of course, growing up, I'm sure if you remember your own childhoods, the thrill of the new, not because it's new, but because it's a way of distancing yourself from your parents, from older generations, it has a certain appeal. And it also has appeal because parents and teachers and politicians, and not to mention scholars, tend to be quite skeptical. So I remember the defining moment of my childhood was when the moms in our little village came together and talked to each other with concern and concluded and told all the children that from this time forward, we were never ever allowed to go to this one boy's home, he was called Rolf, to play unless his parents were home. And why not? They were concerned there could be video. VCR. Rolf's parents had been so irresponsible that they actually bought a VCR. And the stories of what could happen if we actually would go and see this device made them actually say that, persona non grata, don't go there. Of course, he became the most popular boy in school. And the defining moment of my childhood was when we gathered at the home of Rolf's parents. They were not home. We watched this Philips 2000, which was on a huge pine wood table next to the TV. We didn't know how to turn it on. We knew that that was a VCR. We didn't know how to turn it on. We didn't really know that it had anything to do with the TV. Just heard the parents talking about it. But we would sit tightly together under a blanket. And I remember shivering all over my body, looking at this machine and thinking, now something is happening. There's video. And going out of that feeling hormonal, I was sweating, I was feeling older, more capable. 3 weeks later, we figured out how to turn it on. Watched, which was in retrospect perhaps not the wisest choice for a first movie, Jaws. And none of us told our parents. Not even when they were worried that we joined some sort of cult because we refused to shower for a long time after seeing Jaws. And while we were doing this, a week before Rolf's father figured out how to turn on the machine, and my mother doesn't to this day know that I've actually seen Jaws, and I'm not going to tell her, so while we were doing this, the turmoil in the newspapers, among politicians, in the press, among scholars, was extremely high. Everybody was worried, what could this new technology do to children? Could it be mental in terms of development? To the point where, just exemplifying words of one famous conservative Norwegian politician who said in the newspaper Vårt Land, video, you have to realize, video is a form of narcotics. It's the same as with cannabis. We did not think it was so dangerous, and we ended up with heroin. So I'm researching children. And I realized that one of the fascinations about it is that these are the only people who actually grew up with the internet, as it is today. And most of them, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, start using the internet when they're 1. It's not like they race from the crib and crawl and log on, but together with parents, they start using the internet. And they use internet differently. So when we want to talk about the internet, or we want to talk about the digital life, we do it through old glasses. We don't really know what they're doing, how they feel, and if we want to find out, we have to listen. Some years ago, in 2010, I was involved in a huge survey where we surveyed 25,000 children and one of their parents across Europe. It was a representative survey. It had over 7,000 variables. But the one variable, the one result, especially for Norwegian children, that I found most interesting was this. We asked them, and these are 11 to 16-year-olds, we asked them to compare offline and online communication. And what they said was, 27% said, it's easier for me to talk about private things online than offline. Half of them said, 71% of those from low-income families said it's easier for me to talk about all sorts of things online than offline. And over half of the children in 2010, 80% of those from low-income families said it's easier for me to be myself on the internet. The internet is where I am most me. So if you want to know who I am, then you go to the internet. Because internet, this is where I meet my friends. Internet is by far a social media in general, not just social media, but especially, as was mentioned here, gaming, which is the most important thing they do. So we have this problem from our generation, my generation, not growing up with internet, considering internet to a large extent to be what happens when you open your browser and you put www, something, a newspaper, a weather service, some sort of travel agency. And we talk about internet in the terms of pages, which of course the 12-year-olds doesn't get. What is a page on the internet? When I go online, I hang out with my friends. We play games. And what they say is that social media, for us, not just social media, but also internet, is really like life itself. Once I even read somewhere on the internet that people who are not on Facebook are not alive. For instance, a boy I knew who lives in London told me he had a girlfriend. And I was on Facebook then, and I asked him to give me her name. And she wasn't there. He said he doesn't have a Facebook profile. And later it turned out she wasn't real. Of course she wasn't. You know, if you are going to be real, you have to be there. And it's not about narcissism. It is about belonging to the social groups that you feel that you should belong to. It's a way, as this boy said, internet is where I interact with others so I can learn to be my true self. Because social networks they crystallize how you are and how you can be very confronting because of that. And therefore you can learn to be the person you want to be or try to be. And the internet gives a lot of information about how others can possibly see you. But in this, we see the problem of the individual faced by a constant need to make choices. When you're online, you always, every single second, have to make choices, and you have no choice but to choose. There's a constant torrent of decision-making, often considered mundane or irrelevant for adults, but can have detrimental, even global consequences for the individual. It is about pervasive performance as risk management. I have to be there. You have to see me, but I have to do it in a way that doesn't become a risk. It's what Ulrich Beck calls an institutionalized individualization. You're forced to make decisions yourself as an individual, but we're all forced to do it. And we're forced to do it under the umbrella of commercial companies forcing us to do it as consumers rather than citizens. And it can have disastrous consequences. Like this example, where a boy or a sister is about like normal sibling rivalry. Think back, those of you who have siblings. So a sister who told on his brother that he had beer in his room, and the parents grounded him. And he used that time when he was grounded to search his sister's room. And he found this, my hookup list, which is something that a hormonal 14, 15-year-old girl is doing, you know, in the gaze of hormonal, you know, in the privacy of her room. So she made this list about the boys in the school she wanted to have sex with, and in which way. And as the good brother he was mad at his sister, he thought it would be a pertinent revenge to put it online and tag it under "my sister is a whore." And even though it takes about half an hour to realize that this was not such a smart idea, it was then shared thousands and thousands and thousands of times. And you can find it anywhere online. So it is this seemingly mundane instant decision-making that is a problem. This is what I, and also building on Ulrich Beck, will argue is a state where individuals in reflexive modernity are characterized by choice. There is something that has not been there in the same way for previous generations, because we have to make choices all the time, very quickly, as if by a reflex. You have to make decisions without the traditional limitations of class or family, nuclear family, or institution like state or ethnic group. And once they're made, they will probably come back and haunt you at some point. Think about it. You are not, the people in this room, none of you will be forced to face with how you dressed in high school or in junior high. But this generation, they might be. So you can do all kinds of choices and you can redo them. And you can consider friends coming in all sorts of categories and you can rewrite your biography. But if we don't have a way to erase or Tipex over all these choices, we are in trouble. As in the exemplifying words of a woman that contacted me after I had appeared on a news show discussing children and online privacy and reputation, she said, "But you have to understand, this was in high school. This was in junior high. There's a lot of things I did that I regret. I regret the bullying we did. But it's like this. I know there's a lot of stuff that I did that's not so good. People can see it, right? If they Google my name. But when I applied for this job, I put a lot of nice stuff about me also on different sites and services. So like when they Google me, the nice stuff will come up and cover the bullying we did. It will come on the top of the list. And at least the good should neutralize the bad, because I really want this job. And I don't really think that firms should be allowed to Google you when you apply for a job, because that's like private stuff, right? And this complex being your true self online, making yourself vulnerable, communicating intimately with your friends and your girlfriends and your boyfriends, but doing this in a place which is both personal and private and public at the same time, forces us to be extremely competent decision makers. And I'm not sure that we are. So finally, I have a confession to make. I'm not really that interested in children. So I'm often said, and I've been working with research on children for many, many years, presented as a child researcher. But why am I researching children? And the reason why I started researching children and what they do online is because I'm interested in censorship. I'm interested in freedom of expression issues. I'm interested in online censorship. And I realized that looking at totalitarian regimes, but also looking at the European Commission or Norwegian politicians or others, or Senate in the United States, they would all, in meeting, facing this new technology, the fear, the same fear that the Norwegian politicians had with the VCR, they come back arguing for the child, the welfare of the child, seeing that we need to do something in order to protect our children, but without necessarily qualifying that fear and backing up. So what I discovered is that children are more often than others used as crowbar to implement regulatory regimes, arguing for welfare, and it's really hard to say, I don't think we should have this and this regulation, this and this online filtering tools or others, if people claim that then you're against the welfare of children. So the reason why I think it's important is also because children are used as a good excuse by music industry, by politicians, by religious groups, by others. But if you really want to figure out what they do, we should ask them. So, in conclusion, anyone who really want to figure out how free a country is should not look at legislation, should leave debates in parliaments aside. Instead, you should go and look how people behave when meeting excesses of freedom, as we do online. How do people behave when they meet pornography, or the idea of pornography, when they meet the idea of children, when they meet the idea of having our brains, cut off because we are too close to a screen? If we meet those concerns with composure, then freedom is in good hands. If we don't, even as a democracy, we are in trouble. And finally, perhaps seeing, we can, and I see this often, the worry is often about the troublesome use. But if there's one thing I've learned from the Norwegian national hero Nansen, is that regardless what you do, and regardless how old you are, we probably all would end up nude on the internet anyway. Thank you.
Of course, we have used a little more time than promised, but that was because all of your introductions were so incredibly full of perspectives, ideas, and even new facts that we have learned. There's so much we could take up here, and I'm sure you all thought about subjects while you've been listening to the others. While I've been listening to you, I've sort of felt that on a very large scale, some of the subjects group around the word imagination. Thus, the digital technology or the internet open up a new space or room for our imagination, or does it limit it? Like many people would discuss the question whether children are deprived of natural creativity through their use of the internet, or is that just a false question? Like, is that question even not relevant? Could it be that there's no change in our imagination, that it's just that it doesn't matter what medium it is in? Do you have any? And the other category is the idea or fear of a kind of deprivation or loss. So you have imagination on one side and deprivation or loss on the other side. To the question of imagination first, do you think?
Well, I think that Virginia's point about it, the web as a creation, as a great work of art, is a very interesting one, and it also opens up into the areas of how works of art themselves represent in different ways, in different eras. So I think what we're seeing here, I mean, you can take what you were saying one step back and say, what kind of subjectivity is the web representing? You can't take it as the default state of human subjectivity, what we see, the way the I, the ego I, is constituted by young people on the web. This is very definitely within a moment, rather a long moment, but probably going back to Romanticism, where the subject self is seen in a particular set of ways. And that makes the internet a very powerful tool for actually changing a bit of direction on that. Mm-hmm. You know, that we can tell stories in different ways. It matters how we actually tell stories and how we constitute who the characters are, what a character is. What you described, it seems to me, to be not people just saying, when they say, I am me, what they're finding is they're orienting themselves to various compass points. Now, those are the compass points that perhaps can be reimagined in a productive way, so that we actually arrive at new epistemologies of the self. I mean, I know it can't be done. It can't be done by design. It can only be done by a general consciousness and creativity. We can't sort of legislate it or censor it, but it can be done by being aware of it. That, you know, and when children say that they have to have such a pair of sneakers, otherwise they can't go to school, their identity is in danger. You know, how the network of compulsions is working on them.
I really like that you began, talking about the afterlife, because one of the things that I discovered William James wrote about the afterlife is that we're in a sort of mother sea, he said, a kind of cloud-like space. Cloud, capital C, like the cloud, where, if our devices or our bodies deteriorate, that a certain kind of consciousness survives, the secretions of our minds survive. But this isn't enough individuation for the masters of the universe who are now trying to hack death, because you live forever as in a mother sea or in the orientalized internet that Marshall McLuhan described. I think the people trying to hack death right now at Google want to live forever as Sergey and Larry and Ray, not as a mother sea. I do think that the internet has in some ways pushed back, but made more florid our idea of that thing that cannot be digitized about myself. The people you described were like me as a kid. I wasn't comfortable in social space. Good for the people. Someone asked, why didn't you try snowboarding or sports? And I thought, well, if I was good at snowboarding, I wouldn't have done this. I was a reader kid, and I felt happy in symbolic space. And I think if the kids who say I'm more myself here either feel endangered in physical space and social space, or feel not confident, or feel their physical voices aren't strong enough. I don't think it's a mistake that it's the women at the conference, I guess this remains to be seen, who are champions of, as you say, the poor and despised, and children are champions of the opportunity for self-discovery. I did a little bit of work, and then I really want to hear you on this, did a little bit of work in Japan on the internet. Sociologists there, bien-pensant, left-wing sociologists love the internet for kids, and because there's no name, rank, and serial number, there's no fixed status. You can have this free play of imagination and fantasy, and they consider it a given good, that 8 hours on the internet are 8 hours where you're exempt from these constraining social laws. And that, the avatar is you in digital space, and I prefer it to the personality that was you in social space. All that construction around personality that the 20th century had so many manuals about how you were supposed to comport yourself and how you're supposed to sit. I was so happy to be free from the boardroom, requirement that you field flirtation in certain ways without giving it up. I got on the internet and can have an email conversation with a colleague with none of that. I have my whole brain, or almost my whole brain, to do the work that interests me without having to have my hair done.
Elisabeth?
I think, remind me this morning, before I left for coming here, I talked to my 9-year-old son, and he was asking me, what are you doing today? And I said, well, I'm going to talk to this super important people, and I sort of tried to explain, and first he said, why do they want to talk to you? And then I said, well, I think they want to know a little bit about the research we have on children, so if there's anything that you think that we should tell these people that are important about children and the internet, tell me. And then he said, well, Mommy, you need to tell them. What you need to tell them is that children who are not so much online, and children who have problems, you shouldn't let them use the internet less. They should be able to use the internet more, because then they can learn and see how much fun we have, and how many friends they can have. And I think that sort of sums up, so for EU Kids Online, this large project, we're now 33 European countries, I think 150 researchers, it's also expanding, and I think it would be a fair representation to sum up that of all the risks and opportunities that we've researched. One of the things that we're most worried about is not those who use internet excessively, but those who are not online at all. or less online, because we see it has such large consequences. So unlike before, so I was also a very nerdy girl when I grew up and with less social skills. But what I can see now is it's the socially strong are there with all the others online. So it's a place for everyone. It's not this division. And those few who are not there, we are worried about because they lose out on the social, on the democratical, on the educational, and not to mention the entertaining.
Marina?
I think it's interesting to think about Japan, which is a culture I've been to but don't know well, because of the wonderful anime inventions on film. And it seems to me that, again, this shows a different way of actually thinking about human beings in social relations, representations, narrative representations of human beings. And one of the things that I think came through, that I've thought before, that came through your talk, is that actually what we're seeing returning is a form of shame and honor culture, which is something that's very well understood in Japanese history. So that there are very ritual lines and rules around how people are in relation to one another. And what you get on a source of distress for some of the casualties of web friendships, like the girl who was betrayed by her brother, are to do with shame. They're not actually to do with actual things that have been done wrong. I mean, it's not, the old word would be sin, or any kind of crime, or even defect. It's actually to do with social norms as they're constituted. So it seems to me there that this return, which we would think of, certainly in the past, as being a retrograde step, where it actually matters more, that shame matters more than guilt. We think of guilt as having been the discovery of personal responsibility as a sort of development of consciousness. But we're returning to less of that, less of a sense of my personal mistake, to the idea that you've simply been outed, you've been shamed, or there's this indelible print of your failure in the past to wear the right clothes, or to and I think that again needs to be thought of much more broadly when we look at the ethical imperatives that are created by the web. I mean, it's not so much how many hours a child spends on the web, it's what they are experiencing in terms of how they relate to society when they're on the web.
I think that's right.
Yes, I think it also reminds me this shaming, as you say. One of the problems that I think, and I've worked on a lot lately, I work on digital bullying, but as sort of a side of that, you can see internationally, we've had it in here, we've had it in Canada, we had it in the US, several cases where somebody is being, for some reason, at some point, they've taken off their clothes, they've sent the pictures to somebody, either through grooming or through hormonal, interaction with peers, without their clothes on. And at some point, it becomes public. The whole school sees the picture. And instead of thinking, you have been violated.
Yes.
Somebody has hurt your dignity. Instead of thinking that, you're thinking, what a slut. You took off your clothes. And then we can see that instead of getting help, you get an escalated sense of the community against you. And which ends up and one of the sort of worries I have is lack of understanding what it is to be digitally forgiven. We do not forgive ourselves for the mistakes that we do digitally. If you have made that one wrong choice, you have to live with it forever. And I've talked to 12-year-olds to say, if you bully, if you publish pictures of yourself, if you do something, that is we consider shameful, you will never be our friend again.
Yes.
But it's going to be your own fault because you did this online and it's documented and it's going to be there forever. Game over.
But that I think is a little bit of anxiety about photography, because the first talk I gave on magic and loss was I know we always talk about our kids, but it is interesting. It was to my daughter's second grade class, and I said the magic is the excitement of discovering Pokemon Go, and the loss is the sad, sick feeling you have when you've been on the internet so long. Any questions? And someone raised his hand immediately and said, why don't you look like your picture?
Yeah.
Right? And I've actually had sort of shaming conversations in podcasts about how I ought to look like my picture when I show up. And my obligation to that incredibly impressionistic picture of me in pixels that, you know, I mean, you all know well, I had to have my hair done and my eye makeup done and then be shot in light and shadow with perfect, you know, a million snaps. And then they choose the one picture and then they manipulate it. I mean, John Singer Sargent's portrait of me would be closer to the lights and shadows and oils and hair of my own face than a vanity portrait, than this entirely constructed thing. And so when the shaming comes up that you have done these things, that you have appeared naked on camera, I do think drawing that distinction between, you know, I had one horrible day on Twitter and I actually recommend it to everyone. It's like, you know, anyway, I spent a day getting trolled on Twitter and called a cunt, so forth. And I started to think, well, I should stay here and monitor my demise. And then I thought, why don't I let that picture of me that is much more stronger and hairless and more beautiful than I am take sniper fire for me today, and I'm going to go to the beach with my cousins in Florida where I was, and a bad day on Twitter is not a bad day, is not a bad day. I mean, if you construct that avatar well enough for you, you say, Photoshop takes that for me. You know, it's the usual anxiety about pornography is, did you do the things? You know, child pornography is like, is this a crime? Did a crime happen? But if it's created by Photoshop, then it's, you know, a Balthus painting.
I mean, you've put your finger on a problem that is also, you know, a sort of massively underlying problem in the subjectivity that we are trying to move towards. I want to move away from, yeah. And that is that it has to be true.
Yeah.
You are being trolled because you apparently have deceived through your touched-up photograph.
Yeah.
This is so against the acts of memory. Actually, memory is unreliable. We know that. Memory is fabricating. The memory of the self is endlessly embroidering. If we, in natural time, if we actually tell a story to a friend and tell it again 2 years later, it is not the same story.
Yeah, that's
but none of this, and then as for the whole world that you were talking about, of fiction, art, representation, and so forth, one of the great capacities of the human mind is to generate fictions. And so for some reason, this new policing, this new shaming, this new kind of, is against this generative capacity, which is what the internet could do. It is actually constantly being censored. And I'm afraid that I think, in a sort of paranoid way, something that Simon has written about, I think this is to do with niche marketing. They want everybody in a box, whereas they actually can have different, exactly detailed and indelible guidelines to what they're going to sell to them. And that is against the fluidity of human self-creating imagination.
That's right. Yeah.
Elisabeth asked for a comment, and then we'll open for one or two quick questions before coffee break.
Yes.
Elisabeth.
No, it just reminds me that going back to my parents who failed to explain to me about the candy not being sort of the vital point of the pedophile, we sort of, what we can see is also a failure, because we all grew up without the internet. So we know this distinction between, you know, what is truth, what is not, when it's documented that there are sort of gray areas. And one of the situations I learned the most from was some years ago when I attended a school on what was called like a Safer Internet Day, and the focus was on critical thinking and all exactly knowing when is something true, how do you evaluate the information. And we were there with 5th graders, and along with me was a famous Norwegian celebrity, and he would to them about trolling, but he would also talk to them about how, you know, things necessarily are not true. And then we would ask the children to go into this website that we had created beforehand, and on that website it said, the name of the celebrity is going to be the first Norwegian on the moon. And the kids got so impressed. They were like, oh, because he was there, you're going to the moon, you're going to be the first Norwegian in space. And he said, no. I never heard about this. I'm not going to space. And they were like, yeah, but it says so online. And even though he was there in the room saying, I'm not going to space, I never heard about this. They became extremely agitated, aggressive. They started to argue with him. And it became extremely uncomfortable because they were all pointing to their screen saying, it says that you're going to space. Until there was a little guy at the end of the room who raised his hand and he said, but it says here online that you are going to be in space and that you're going to leave on the 7th of February. But that's today. Hurry! So we fail.
Yes, that's right.
Thank you. Yes, I have loads of more questions, and I'm sure you do as well. We'll open for 1 or 2 questions, I hope, before the organizers will accept that. Yeah, thank you. John?
Well, I had a whole lot of questions, but 2 really bother me. One is, I have observed in my students a distinct decline in their capacity for sustained concentration. Their ability to master part 2 of Kant's transcendental deduction of the categories, never very strong, seems to have gone down in the past 20 years. And my guess is this has something to do with the fact that they spend hours and hours a day on something called Facebook. You have no idea what the low intellectual level of Facebook is. It's a combination of imbecility and narcissism. So that's my first question. Are there any studies that actually document the decline in the capacity for concentration, that is the concentration span, and as a result of spending many, many hours a day in front of the screen? The second thing is a harder question to answer or even to pose, and that is, what exactly is the effect of the internet on sexuality? Now, Marina pointed out something very important, namely the disappearance of female pubic hair. This has not been, as far as I know, systematically studied, but I think there is distinctly, well, I won't go into detail, but I think there is an imitation of the model of sexuality provided by the internet, and I would like to know, since it appears a high percentage of internet use is directed at pornography, using that as a general term for sexuality, are there any studies? What are the effects of this on people?
Who wants to answer the question either on concentration capacity or sexuality and pubic hair?
Well, on the pubic hair issue, it seems to me to be a very good example of probably virgins not having any idea what it actually is to have penetrative sex and what the function, anatomical, helpful function of pubic hair is. So in fact, this would make it far more, I mean, it's just not terribly good for young women to shave their pubic hair because of many, many reasons. I mean, it's rather the same thing as not having eyelashes. You know, you need to have protective elements. I mean, I can be more specific if you want, but it risks becoming, you know, rather alluring.
I'm also interested in the intellect. I mean, is there? Do any of you have any opinions about the effect of continued internet use on intellectual sensibility?
Well, for that we would need longitudinal studies. And those who have actually grown up with internet, they're not old enough yet. So we don't know. But we could start it if somebody would fund it. But yes, and I also, on the pubic hair, isn't that back? I thought it was sort of, it goes up and down in waves, and just like
this is
pre-internet.
As a hair as a design principle, absolutely. Yeah. I love that we aspire to the status of an iPhone. I mean, the aesthetic of an iPhone. First of all, I'm skeptical of the idea of studies to begin with that are not ideological. But second, I also use Kant as my example, mostly because since I'm not sure we're representing the human would-be attention span well right now, I love to hear stories about what it used to be. Where did people picked up the Critique of Pure Reason, dawn to dusk with a German-English dictionary, and just paced through it. That's always the perfect example because Kant is notorious for throwing off your attention. And I'd leave it to Kant. I mean, if Kant is the dominant spectacle that we're meant to pay attention to, he ought to have done better at seizing our attention. And I can't construct the stuntedness of my own attention in the mirror of, highly unseductive prose. It's not fair to that I am somehow deficient or deprived of something. Also, the tradition of professors who formerly blamed television, complaining that their students have gotten dumber in the last 20 years, is something I'm familiar with in my own father. I think I remember, we were distracted by distraction from distraction in Eliot's day, and we are, always already more distracted than we were the year before, it seems.
But actually, I introduced, in a creative writing course, I introduced the Bauhaus and Black Mountain technique of getting the students to go out and actually find fabrics and materials. And they were delighted, first of all, with this project. I mean, they found it really enjoyable, but it absolutely improved their capacity to read and understand what they were reading. Because they had actually sort of begun to think about grit and velvet and things, it worked better for them. It's partly an effect of English literature is extremely descriptive and sensuous, so there's a lot of references of that kind which people do not pick up on anymore because they've never seen a piece of brocade. But it's,
there's maybe less brocade in Kant than you might expect.
I think we need to go to a coffee break now. Yeah. So I think we'll let Kant's brocade be the last words for this session. I'm sure you have many more questions. We'll have to debate them amongst ourselves over coffee. And I just want to thank Virginia Heffernan, Elisabeth Staksrud, and Marina Warner for giving us so many perspectives.
Thank you.
Thank you.